Terrorism, A Very Short Introduction by Charles Townshend. One of the main points taken from this book is terrorism means violence. There are many sections in Chapter 3 and 4 that talk about people believing violent acts are directly associated with terrorism. For example, page 39 of the text states Sergio Panunzio defined terrorism as indirect violence, attacking the innocent with the intention of intimidating others, as well as page 51 where the author says, running through any account of state terror is the tension between terror as a semi-random byproduct of massive repressive violence and terrorism as a deliberately focused product of demonstrative violence. The reign of terror can be briefly summarized as unjustified killings made by the sovereign people. These people believed their actions were rational because in the midst of public alarm and excitement, no one could prevent them from doing so, leaving them to think they were doing the right thing. This is found on page 38. 3 functional levels of state terrorism. On page 41, the author brings up a college textbook that identifies these levels as intimidation, coerced conversion, and genocide. Townshend tells us how these levels are overtly repressive, but in times of crisis the constitutional states have used ferocious action. Individual terror, a term given by the Bolsheviks who were against the individualism aspect more than the violence. While Marx defined revolutionary terrorism as the only way to shorten the agonies of the old society and the birth pangs of the new, Lenin had a more subtle approach, saying each individual act of violence were unconnected with the mass of the people. This is located on page 55. An argument in Chapter 3 is the reign of terror caused the revolution to think it was under threat, having them confront their enemies. On page 38, the author discusses how the revolution believed to be under threat with the terror had becoming so out of control. But around the time the revolution decided to do something, it was proven moot because the threat of the terror was receding. Another argument was that natural violence is required to resist oppression and preserve liberty against tyranny. These revolutionaries defined their enemies of the terror as vultures or leashes. However, Marat argued otherwise, saying that such killings was an imprescriptible right of the sovereign people, the natural violence required to resist oppression and preserve liberty against tyrannies. Indiscriminate terror. A quote by Carlos Marighella in the book says, "Better to act mistakenly than do nothing for fear of doing wrong." This was what he says in contrast to others exclaiming that these violent acts were to purposely kill members of common people. It is stated that he was defending a just cause, the cause of them people. He believed terror wasn't targeted at a certain group of people, but instead that it wasn't terror at all. It was guerrilla tactics. A common theme in these chapters was rationalism. Was the terror they caused right or wrong, and who decides? Chapter 3 expands upon the reign of terror, saying it transformed the revolution in the eyes of many outsiders from a liberating to a destructive force. At the same time, their rationalism itself drove them to rework the justification of political violence. He goes on to say that justifications had to be found for the violent killings because they couldn't appear unwarranted, since such actions couldn't be prevented in all of the public chaos. Another common theme in these chapters was violence. An example that proves this theme is in Chapter 4 under the Groupuscular Terrorism subsection. They were a terrorist group called Red Brigades formed in 1969. They started their violent terror acts with armed robberies, and fire bombings of cars and theaters started in November of 1970. The author continues on with statistics of terrorist violence increasing from 467 acts to 2,725 acts in a matter of only 3 years.